Thank you, Neil. Again, as Neil said, I'm Tim Johnson, program chair for this year. I get to stand up here. It's a team that makes this happen. It's amazing to look out at a room full of faces, colleagues at the end of their career, but many, many young, aspiring future leaders. It's great to have so many representatives from our Indigenous family, and I appreciate the kind words of the opening remarks. Reminding all of us that we are an inclusive, and we need to do a better job of making sure everyone's voice is heard and included in all the conversations. I have the honor right now of being able to introduce our first plenary speaker. We've got 3 great speakers lined up this week. Our first speaker is Linda Mortsch, who's devoted her 40-year career to really addressing climate change and facilitating adaptation in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Basin. She co-led the 1990s binational project, adapting to climate variability and change in the Great Lakes Basin, which was one of the first to engage stakeholders and explore adaptation to climate change. She's contributed to all of the Canadian National Climate Change Assessment reports, and since 1989, she's participated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including being the co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. For the 2022 assessment, the 6th assessment, she was the coordinating lead author for the North American chapter. Linda retired from Environment Climate Change Canada in 2015, and she now consults and has an adjunct appointment at the University of Waterloo's Faculty of the Environment. Her current research focuses on advancing climate change adaptation in coastal areas through integrated coastal planning and management. And with that, I welcome Linda to the stage. And yeah, hiding behind the microphone, but yes.
So how do we get this presentation up here? Magically. Oh my goodness. Okay. Magic. I'll start to say that this is a wonderful opportunity. Geez. I see Carrie Ann's face here, but not my presentation.
You see the big monitor?
Yep, I do. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much, Tim, for the introduction. And thank you very, very much for the organizing committee of this conference for setting up such a wonderful opportunity for all of us to come together again. I also look upon this as an opportunity to allow me to reminisce and reminisce about climate change and climate change adaptation as it has unfolded and been part of my career for many more decades than I'd like to count. And also for the opportunity to reflect on experiences, lessons learned, knowledge, and try to integrate that to provide you, the IAGLR community, with some insights as to how we might address this important, still evolving issue of climate change within the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin, and how we work together to think about adaptation, etc. So this talk has 3 components. I think I'll start with the big picture and draw upon my intergovernmental panel on climate change experience, because I look to that as the gold standard for integrating climate change information and knowledge into reports that are very useful. Plus, it gets an enormous amount of review and revision and thinking. Second, I'd like to draw out for you what has been the evolution of impacts and adaptation in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin. So I'm going to touch upon some key questions that we asked. I'll try to identify some studies that illustrate some key points, and primarily I'm going to draw on my experience in wetlands, water resources, vulnerability, and cities, etc. And then offer you by decade, loosely framed by decade, some insights that I would like to present to you. And then lastly, I'd like to give you maybe 4 or 5 slides on how we might move forward with respect to climate change to meet our biggest challenge, implementation of adaptations throughout different sectors, in different communities, in different parts of the Great Lakes Basin. So IPCC, how has the concept been defined, and what has been an evolution? I used the glossary, which receives an incredible amount of attention, to sort of lay out for you some of the definition of adaptation as it's evolved over time, but also then to highlight for each assessment reports some of the important ideas that emerge that are relevant to the Great Lakes and sort of signal where the thinking was at that time with respect to adaptation. So this is the 3rd assessment report cover. It was published in 2001, and there were two other previous assessment reports, the FAR and the SAR. But this is the report that first had a chapter on adaptation, which meant that there was enough research for us to be able to synthesize key information and present it as a way of defining and establishing and putting adaptations place along with mitigation, adaptation responding to the impacts of climate change, and mitigation reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. This chapter, this first try at adaptation was really starting just to get a definition. What is this word? How do we think of it? And so some of the key ideas, of course, are the who, individuals to sort of private sector, et cetera, the scale, the type of adaptation. Do we want to focus on attitude change, policy, technology, or behavioral change? And the last 2, I think we spent an awful lot of attention on, and it evolved and progressed with time, is the timing of the adaptation. So do we want to be anticipatory, which was something that we were really, really trying to promote, proactive, or are we just going to be reactive, responding to extreme events or unforeseen climate changes or impacts? And then the how. There was, I think, too much attention focused on natural or autonomous because it'll just happen, was sort of the main thinking of the time. People will just adapt. But I think we start to realize that no, this has to be planned and purposeful. In 2007, this was the definition in quotation marks, and I'm going to sort of keep putting up the definition. I won't read it out. I'll let you sort of read it and see how the idea has evolved or not evolved with time. The couple of points that I'd like to share with everyone is that why adaptation? And it became a growing realization that some adaptation responding to the impacts of a changing climate were becoming necessary because some climate change was inevitable because of the greenhouse gases that were already in the atmosphere, what we called committed warming. We were also starting to not only detect and sort of observe changes in the climate, but we were also starting to understand that maybe we were starting to see some of the impacts associated with a changing climate. So that gives even more relevance to figuring out how you're going to adapt to that. Out of that grew the realization or the necessity of needing to understand how to develop an understanding or appreciate what society's vulnerability to climate change might be. Not only society, but ecosystems, economic systems, etc. And also to understand if we have to adapt, what is the deficit? Where are we falling short in terms of our knowledge, our human capital, our economics to address this particular issue? And so, although there was still a lot of doubt, we're starting to talk about that planned anticipatory adaptation was much less costly and damaging than a reactive adaptation. 2014 report. For me, the two highlighted, underlined words really resonated with me when these ideas started to percolate up out of the assessment process and the writing process, was the idea of incremental adaptation. So that's where bit by bit changes, one's really just trying to almost, in a sense, make minor changes around different activities, but not really understanding what the full scale might mean. And you want to keep things as they are. For me, the idea of transformational adaptation, sort of really understanding that the rate of climate change, the thresholds, the exceedance of coping capacity may necessitate rethinking how we do many things. For example, do we allow for migration of species and also assisted migration? A values discussion, a real important discussion of how we manage our ecosystems. The other two points is that we weren't really making much progress on adaptation. We were starting to plan in municipalities, and they were assessing impacts, but proactive adaptation, sort of with a long-term view, was really only beginning in energy and public infrastructure. The most recent, the 2022 IPCC assessment, a real challenge because of all of the changes that were happening around that time with COVID, and trying to get people to come together and talk about and work together on producing this chapter. Just think about trying to represent in meetings people representing every single time zone of the world. Nevertheless, this final definition, in human systems, the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. That's remained consistent. And I think it's understanding that this is a process that was really important. And the distinction was made that recognized in natural systems that autonomous or natural adaptation happens, but that there may be a need for human intervention to facilitate or get out of the way of natural systems for adapting. So a couple of key points. Adaptation is an ongoing, evolving process, and I like to think about adaptive management. You don't adapt and then things are done. We're in the midst of a changing climate that will require this adaptive management process, or thinking about what's the next step. What are the, coping capacity exceedances or thresholds or et cetera that we anticipate in the future. Nature-based solutions and the role of nature and the preservation of 30% of the globe in terms of natural ecosystems was something that came to the fore. Another issue is financing of adaptation. How, for example, in coastal zones, if you want to do innovative work with transformational adaptations along the coastline with nature-based solutions, how do you finance that? So that's a key issue, not only within developing countries, which is very obvious, but I think in developed countries as well. How do we finance this? And how do we decide what gets financed? And then another key issue is if we're going to undertake adaptation, let us also think about maladaptation, things that don't work out, unintended consequences, and thinking about lock-in, for example, that if you build something, will that stop your capacity or inhibit your capacity to respond to a changing conditions? Are you locked in with infrastructure, let's say, for example? So that's the big overview of IPCC and how the idea of adaptation has evolved. What I'd like to do now is focus on the Great Lakes and sort of highlights over the decades, looking back and to the front, to the fore, about what have we done. But I'd like to start with two slides that sort of set the context, thinking context that helped me sort of place the studies and the ideas that I'm going to present to you after this. So first is thinking about how adaptation and the thinking of adaptation is a process and how has it evolved. And so the work that we undertook to the very beginning was trying to raise awareness. Next, one would think that would try to do assessments, problem definition, what's impacted. Next, think about adaptation planning. How do we actually do this? Then the next step is implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation of your adaptation measures, strategies, options, etc. So I'd like, when I do this, the rest of this presentation, I'd like to challenge you to think about, what have we focused over the decades on in terms of adaptation, and what is our progress? This is a framing of climate change assessment. And we used to talk an awful lot about top-down and bottom-up adaptation. The first, sort of on the top left-hand side, you'll see IAV, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And that's associated with the upside-down triangle on the far right, what we call the top-down approach. You start with world development, population growth, economic development, how that feeds into CO2, greenhouse gases, global climate models, regionalization, impacts, and vulnerability. Physical, I would also argue that there's also environmental, etc. Bottom up is looking at indicators of vulnerability, and also how you want to characterize adaptive capacity. And that's the VIA, the vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation, that talks about adaptive capacity, has a current and historical focus to understand the here and now and place, and how the historical context influences social conditions or physical conditions. This next slide shows a more detailed example of what this might be from a Great Lakes water availability, water management perspective. So the bottom up is from the perspective of, or the knowledge base of, water resource managers or the practitioner communities. So what is the socioeconomic conditions? What are the important flows or water levels? And what's the current governance and management regime? The top down is sort of the knowledge base of climate and hydrologic modelers and that community, where you look at possible climate changes, how that might affect flows and lake levels, And then in the middle, when the two join together, bottom and top down, the hybrid is where you really would like to end up. And I'll show you an outcome later on from the International Great Lakes study where there's a risk matrix where you bring those together, where you use the bottom up to understand what the monitoring, the governance, and the requirements are for people in a place. And you link that up with how the climate might change to come up with a risk profile. So what's happened in the Great Lakes? I started in 1980. I started my career with Environment Canada in 1982. And so I have the liberty of trying to do decade by decade and share some of the insights and the information from that point. So what happened in the 1980s? The key questions were, was how is the atmosphere changing? So we had Mauna Loa, the measurements of CO2 increase in the atmosphere. And the question became, how will the climate system change? And so the rock stars, the key people at that time, were the global climate modeling community, and we were enhancing the capacity to do that. Although if you look at how far that community has come, it is amazing. It was 2 times CO2 scenarios, which we used then, which was you had your global climate model. It wasn't necessarily linked to the ocean. You doubled you ran the model in current conditions, you hammered it with a doubling of 2 times CO2, and you came up with the future climate, and you took a difference to come up with what will the climate be like that. And there was no time stamp with that. We guesstimated it would be 2050 to 2075. Along with those sort of key climate questions was the climate program, at least in Canada, that was trying to address what are some of the biophysical and socioeconomic impacts. And there was a 1987 study, I show it's the Climate Change Digest, that one of the key questions with respect to the Great Lakes was what's the influence on hydropower generation and navigation? And so that was brought forward. There was no real sense of adaptation or discussion about adaptation. It was more, do we have a problem here, and raising awareness. Also, the key insight to emerge from the 80s is that we have a knowledge deficit. There was a real, though, excitement at that time in bringing together people, researchers in Canada, US symposium, not only within the Great Lakes, but on the East Coast and the prairies. And the whole intent was to build regional awareness, initiate collaborations to start to undertake studies to address this important issue within regions. And the whole idea was, can we gauge and engage what the decision makers want or need if by talking with them? Can we highlight some of the problems that we may experience and what might be our information needs? And so out of a lot of those collaborations, and you'll see the covers of 3 important, for me anyway, meetings, was laying the groundwork for a call for an integrated climate change study in the Great Lakes. Do we have a societal problem, and what can we do? The 1990s. A lot of the discussion was, how do we reduce the uncertainty? Out of that call and a lot of work together, there was a binational study funded on both sides with leadership through NOAA, IAGLR, and also US EPA and Environment Canada, as well as province and states. So the whole idea was to get an understanding, start the process of doing some research in ecosystem health, human health, water resources planning and management, and land use, to illustrate the impacts of climate variability and climate change. We still hadn't gotten to the point of talking solely about climate change. That was not on the agenda. People felt more comfortable talking about climate variability and how do we cope and respond to that, rather than acknowledging that we might have a climate change problem. Nevertheless, the discussion was around extreme events, how climate variability, how do we anticipate and prepare for that? So some of the key insights from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin project was we still had a primarily biophysical focus. And it was a real challenge to introduce and think about the human dimensions of climate change, the socioeconomic perspectives. I mean, it was very few economists who would be willing to talk about climate change and do those assessments. One of the fledgling things that you have to understand is, how do we go from the climate models or the information on the climate system to understanding what the impacts might be, or the outcomes of changes in temperature, precipitation, water levels, and how do you link that to the environment, to social and economic systems? And so people were asking, how do you do the transition? What kind of scenarios do you use? How do you develop them? How do you put them in your biophysical models? One of the key things that I thought was important was we were challenged with doing an integrated climate study. But I just didn't want to do an integration of all the biophysical impacts in a model. We tried to integrate some of the impacts in an input-output economic model for an integrated assessment. But what I really thought was important was to integrate climate change information into policy programs, planning activities, because that would be a way of introducing and making people aware of the need to do adaptation, to introduce them to that. One of the other key things is that we really needed to have stakeholder engagement. It couldn't just, they had to be involved in the research, the impact assessment, because how else would they gain the capacity and the knowledge to be aware of climate change, to have the understanding of the assessment process and what that meant to them, and how they could be at the table to come up and use their expertise and their context and their needs in how to come up with adaptations. So I'm going to share with you now a couple of studies to illustrate how beginner level we were in terms of assessing the impacts. And this is work that was undertaken in the early stages when we didn't have transient climate change assessment. We had 2 times CO2. And one of the outcomes was a decline of 5 meters in water levels in Lake Erie. And so we did a what if of what that knew, if the water levels went down, that annual average water levels went down that much, what would the coastline look like? And so here's an example of a what if output. And I don't think this is raising awareness. I wouldn't make decisions based on this kind of assessment. And I think that has to be put on the table as well. Here's another example of work that, building on that, related to the wetlands in the Great Lakes. One of the first sort of assessments directly it was qualitative. It tried to identify links to climate, because a lot of this was new. I mean, climate makes a difference in things. People always thought about climate as normals, it's just the average, perhaps a bit of variability. And to introduce people to the thought that climate might be changing was really quite novel. So we tried to identify some sensitivities. We used a what if and so what sort of approach. You can see sort of the flow chart along the right-hand side of the slide about how we tried to organize ourselves. And we used two scenarios: hypothetical water level change scenarios, a change in the mean and a change in the seasonal distribution, earlier onset of high water levels. And I just pulled the table to illustrate, not to go into any detail, that we tried to identify the scenario, what would happen to vegetation, fish, water quality, etc. And the adaptations that emerged out of that weren't really, this is what you do. It was more of asking questions. What would you do in terms of waterfowl management or wetland management if this were to occur? So what were some of the key insights from the 1990s? I think this is one of my favorite slides because it really brings home what's stakeholder engagement was crucial, but there were some pretty uncomfortable discussions around climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. I remember a Great Lakes event where a room this size in about the 1990s or maybe even the early 2000s, where in the question period, and I hope no one does this to me today, someone stood up and said, with this adaptation, aren't you jumping the gun? Shouldn't you be mitigating? Aren't you giving up on doing something about the root of the problem, which is increasing greenhouse gases? Shouldn't you be focused on mitigation instead of giving an out through using adaptation so that we don't do something about that? And so we had to really think about that. And part of it is also identifying the need to adapt to current climate variability, and any potential future changes. And so we talked about no regrets, least regrets, and win-win adaptations. So here in the bold are some of the key statements. We'll deal with climate change when we see it happening. So that gave impetus to climate change detection and attribution work. Can we really solidly develop a program to do that? And this is the one that the next one is the one I found most difficult. So when you tell me exactly what's going to happen, then I'll deal with adaptation. Give me your worst case or your best case scenario. Well, and people were uncomfortable. This was new information. It was evolving. But also the question, the way, tell me your best answer, isn't really the best way to address the problem of climate change. And that's where resilience comes out. You don't want to optimize. You don't want to pick the best climate change scenario or the best solution. You want to understand what the driving or climate conditions or the local coping capacity can handle, and make sure that responses can address that. Another comment was, our decisions are based on historical statistics, not modeling, because we were presenting climate models. And lastly, we don't have the time or the money to deal with climate change now. It's sometime off in the distant future. We don't have to deal with it now. And I think part of the communication and awareness raising was that had to make people understand that climate change exacerbates existing management problems, such as floods or temperature issues, etc. The 2000s. I think that when the IPCC said that warming of the climate system is unequivocal and that there's a human influence on the climate system, that people started to realize that perhaps the past was not necessarily a reliable guide to the future. And that's how we talked to the community. We were starting to realize that that there were trends in climate changes, warming air temperature was the best example, of course, the most solid, and that they were detecting changes. And so then the question becomes, what is the vulnerability? How are we going to suffer impacts and consequences? And so they also realized that some of the impacts that we are likely to experience are outside our planning and design experience. We have to think beyond that. We have to think to the future to think about those conditions. And so we had to start thinking about adaptation as a means to give us some extra room to deal with those increasing variability and the trends and changes. And so that schematic there from Canadian Assessment Report 2004, but it's relevant. It shows how in the past we viewed things that between the gray bars was climate variability in our coping range, and that we might have extreme events that would exceed the upper or lower thresholds. But on the whole, we stayed within this gray band. But with climate change, we're starting to realize that we may exceed these upper thresholds or lower thresholds, and then we may not have the coping capacity to deal with it. I'd like to highlight a couple of studies from that also on wetlands, which is a wetland vulnerability study that I had the real pleasure to work with Department of Fisheries, Oceans, Canadian Wildlife Service, University of Waterloo, Environment Canada, and then some consultants as well. And the first part of the report and the study was we wanted to sort of integrate a little bit wetland vegetation, birds, and fishes. And the first part was a vulnerability assessment based on historical knowledge and current requirements about what might be the vulnerability of fish. And this is an example of fish study done by Sudoka et al., where they looked at the current risk status, let's see if I remember this correct, the temperature requirements for spawning and also adult life stage, as well as vegetation and water depth. And so they came up with a vulnerability index of 99 lacustrine fish species. We also looked at doing a future assessment, modeling scenario-based water levels on how wetland vegetation and birds and fish would respond to that as well. The adaptations that we talked about were two that were quite common for that time, was discussions about water level regulation in the upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior and Lake Ontario, and recognizing that we needed that variability to maintain ecosystems, that we shouldn't manage for a narrow range. And then also talking about how important that wetlands are within the landscape and how we might do better at land use planning and policy and programs. So here's an example of the wetland modeling vegetation communities on the left-hand side, only showing one climate change scenario, which we called warm and dry. Could also give it another name that might link it to climate policy, saying no climate mitigation or something. But we had a different framing. We didn't think about linking to mitigation, but what the physical outcome was. So on the left, as you see the modeling, the top is in initial conditions with low water level conditions. We also did our initialization with high water level conditions to show some of the range, not picking one. And then what would the outcome? Same with Joel Ingram and his team doing the work on nesting obligates emergent, and sort of showing how the wetland habitat would change and how that would influence bird density. I use this, I brought this up because This was a proposal for adaptation, and it was the idea of the coastal corridor concept, protect wetlands, connect wetlands to a broader landscape, raise public awareness and involve shoreline landowners, but also calling for an implementation structure, which I'll bring forward near the end of my talk. But this was, I think, 2006 or 2008, seemed kind of reasonable and forward-looking. I'd like to just also bring in a urban example and also really highlight how one frames vulnerability influences the type of adaptations that come to the fore, or your framing or your understanding of where you might be vulnerable. So this is an example of work with the University of Western Ontario. We used a different kind of scenario generating technique, but also we tried to map the new flooding zones under a scenario of increased intensity of precipitation events. And we looked at the flooding from the three different perspectives: the hazards, the traditional hazards assessment, emergency preparedness, and social vulnerability and adaptive capacity, which was the new part. And we were trying to understand or sort of communicate out the capacity to plan proactively for flood proofing and risk reduction, sort of anticipatory, responding during an emergency, and then recovery after. So I'm going to quickly go through these, but this is an example of how we mapped and identified the new 1 in 100, 1 in 250, and 1 in 500 flood zone to communicate out the new risk regime spatially, and with the wonders of GIS allowing us to put in different kinds of land use and location of buildings. And that's the traditional, how many houses, the area, etc., to inform at the very basic level what's vulnerable. Doesn't really tell you often how to adapt necessarily, just gives you a sense of what the risk is. This is an emergency preparedness framing with the new flood lines and what sort of key infrastructure might be affected. And for example, there's a water sewage treatment plant that was vulnerable to flooding. So you identify, or roads that might impede access, or access to hospitals, etc., like that. And then lastly, the social vulnerability, using Canada Census information by dissemination, this area, the smallest sort of public accessing information on community makeup, to ask, well, where are the elderly? Where are there people without access to cars? And some of what is the people, single family homes or immigrants, so that you can target, for example, communication about flooding. Where might there be need for, if people don't have car, how do you, if there's an evacuation noted, how do you help those people evacuate? So this was trying to come up with social, the people, the human dimensions component of adaptation. 2000, what were some of the key insights? So mainstreaming became really important, planning informed by scenarios and monitoring, and also the idea we need to develop our capacity to adapt. And on the right-hand side is sort of a schematic of processes or components of adaptation that was identified in the report Adapting to Climate Change, that had 59 recommendations for Ontario on how to build adaptation resilience. So the 2010s, building capacity. So what did we do? We realized that with the information that maybe the climate is changing, that there's a really significant, that stationarity is dead, that we really need as due diligence to start to include climate change information in our practice. And so a lot of agencies, particularly at the federal level, started to engage professional organizations, Canadian planners, engineering, accountants, etc. And there's also an awful lot of reports produced that identified best practices, how to get climate data sources, develop those, and also identify key tools. And I think we started to realize that we need, and GLISA has done a really good job of this, about talking about knowledge brokers, and URANOS as well in Quebec, about being boundary organizations and sort of making that link between science, the key science, but then also the practice. How do you do something about this? I just wanted to quickly talk about the adaptive management setup in terms of the International Upper Great Lakes study. They came up with a risk evaluation matrix where they asked the technical working groups to identify different coping zones and what they were expecting and what they were managing too. And this would be the foundation for making a proposal to do adaptive management using modeling and identifying actions that would minimize the risk. And here is an example. Remember the top down, bottom up. Here's an example where the two were merged together. Along the left-hand side, zone A, B, and C were those thresholds for water levels that A were optimal, C, we got a problem. And then along the right-hand side were different climate scenarios identifying the plausibility of those water levels occurring and sort of linking to risk and how you might address that. And so you can monitor and understand that if you reach a threshold or a tipping point, that perhaps you might need to do some kind of action. With adaptation, there was an increasing relevance of resilience, and I put the definition there on the right-hand side. But the goal of adaptation is to maintain or increase resilience and reduce vulnerability of ecosystems and people. But how do you do that? And how do you actually implement adaptation for vulnerability and resilience? Here's an example of resilience thinking and how important it is to understand what kind of resilience you're trying to promote. Is it resilience as resistance, build a dike or prevent any kind of change? Resilience as recovery, allowing wetland ecosystems the opportunity or the capacity to rebound and perhaps reorganize. And then creative transformation, sort of really pushing the bounds on terms of rethinking the way we do things. Landscape level planning for wetlands or coastal zone. Assisted migration of species, as I mentioned, a real hot topic for values discussion. Do we want to do this? And nature-based solutions. Coming to the end here now, I want to highlight some work done by Greg Main at Environment and Climate Change Canada that's really trying to address the question of resilience thinking for Great Lakes coastal wetlands, to answer the questions, resilience to what, for what, of what, I mean, and for whom, and taking a social ecological perspective that integrates all those different economic, political, governance, as well as ecosystem ideas together. I'm going to highlight some of the key adaptation ideas that came out, but this project work also did significant modeling, assessment, and stakeholder engagement. So here's the framework for implementation that I alluded to at the beginning. And here is on the left-hand side is sort of the resilience pathway. We have three different kinds of ways of looking at adaptation: the strategy, the high level aspirational strategic outcomes. And here on the right-hand side, you'll see 6 that were identified through this program that addresses not only the climate change component, but I think the non-climatic stressors that are also really key to addressing climate change, and allowing for that ecosystem adaptive capacity. Down to the very bottom, they're talking about improved coastal wetland conservation and protection. So 2010s showed that we're poised for implementation. I mean, people lack the confidence. I think perhaps we focused on impacts, vulnerability assessment, building capacity, asking resilience questions, and planning adaptation. But I think, as the quote below shows, that we really have experience with planning, but we don't know how to yet do the implementation. And I think that that's the new frontier. So what are we looking to the future? I'd like to share with you a couple of ideas that I think that are important. Of course, foundational to any of the really solid work that we need to do to deal with the future is to understand now and where we're going. And I think monitoring and data are often vulnerable to budget cuts, and it's really a foundational need because it underpins our knowledge and it informs our assessments. It's crucial for adaptive management if you want to think about, setting targets and goals, and then if monitoring is crucial to understanding if any changes have occurred. So I'd like to do a call out to Sapna Sharma's presentation tomorrow that will talk in more detail about the benefits, in this case, of monitoring for ice. But another need that often is forgotten is progress on adaptation. When we set those goals and where we want to go with our adaptation, if we want continued support, financial support programs, we have to show how the adaptations are making a difference, if they are, and if they are not, course corrections, or etc. And so I think we need some kind of thinking, important thinking, on how we might evaluate and what adaptations, what are the indicators, and how we might monitor those. Through the IPCC and growing recognition is that, and Carrie Ann will talk about the different worldviews, the importance of including different kinds of knowledge through traditional knowledge in the work that we do, in the adaptations that we do. And I think that this is a real call out to meaningful, respectful, and appropriate engagement with Indigenous peoples. It's almost last slide here. This is, I think, really, really important for me anyway, because I was observing that there was a mistaken framing. I think it came from local, bottom up, going down, top down to local. What is local? And I think that place-based, be that place the whole of the Great Lakes for adaptations that make sense across that scale, to adaptations within a watershed or a spawning habitat. But I think it was mistakenly framed that all climate change is local. And the framing came from, you're going to see the impacts at the local level. And so it makes sense to do the adaptations. And the adaptation is that local responsibility. But I must say that adaptation is a cross-cutting, all of society effort. And it requires collaboration, real significant collaboration. And we have to recognize and get over our organizational silos, that there are nested impacts and there are also nested jurisdictions and mandates. And somehow you have to align those jurisdictions or those mandates or those programs so that they don't work against each other. So that if the federal government gives you disaster recovery money, that it isn't just to recover to what was there when the event happened, but allows some kind of transformation. On the right-hand side is also rethinking things. This is work that's been idea about littoral cells and thinking, along the coastline for the physical unit, like we talk about the watershed unit. Funding is crucial, and we need to think about different kinds of funding for those transformational adaptations. I mean, we need to rethink things, have to have community engagements to get the support. We need to do the research to come up with the adaptations. And so you need to also think about different funding ways. So for example, in the Great Lakes Coast, if you infrastructure funding often has a very short time frame, 2 years or 3 years. You have to do shovel-ready adaptations. Well, sometimes it takes more than 2 years to come up with an adaptation. And I think we need to think about how we can support that creative transformation and that creative, important research work and community engagement that needs to be done to come up with those adaptations. The last words are from practitioners. I did a series of interviews on coastal management and planning on the 4 coasts, important coasts of Canada. And here are just some of their points. And I think leaving the highlighted, just mentioning some of the highlighted, we have plenty of information in assessments for actions that need to be taken. The neglected part is the social side. 20% of the challenges are technical and 80% are the social science challenge. So that was actually from an engineer working on resilience. And I think one that I thought was quite intriguing was from a provincial government representative who said the transformation was getting everyone in the room and people being able to see themselves in the solution. They were working in their silos. When they came together, they could see the issue together and they could see the trade-offs, and they came up with a solution where everyone felt that they had a stake in it and that they came up with a hybrid coastal infrastructure idea. So I'd like to say thank you for your attention. It's been a nice, for me, trip down memory lane. And if there's still time for questions, I'll take those.